clearly the Slipspace engine was an issue, I would say, for a liability even for the studio. And the final game of Halo Infinite definitely did not live up to where did not live up to where I would have expected it to land. And as a result, by shifting to Unreal, that does create some interesting opportunities, shall we say.
Right.
And I think, Alex, firstly we should say that we're generally not fans of studios abandoning in-house technology, and do tend to prefer seeing studios sort of leverage their own internal tech. That's very interesting to look at and discuss and analyze. But this is definitely one of those few cases where I actually see a compelling argument for making the shift, because I think from an engineering, manpower, money, and just general investment, it makes a lot of sense for them to actually make the switch to Unreal. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, to talk about some plus points about like this, like what you just described there, I think there's a synergy that comes with moving over to Unreal. For one, you have the synergy with the rest of the industry, where people who are either amateurs or they're learning at university, or their experience coming from other teams is having had worked already with Unreal Engine. So the pool of people you can hire from becomes a lot greater, instead of having to spend a lot of time onboarding them with the own software that you have been creating, for example, for the last 20 years almost or so. Because I think actually Slipspace's origins still actually go back to what was made after Reach, right? With Destiny. I think that's like its original origins. So it's actually really old in that aspect. And they do mention that in the Microsoft blog, Xbox Wire blog, that kind of accompanied this announcement. So you have that synergy with getting a lot of people on board. You also have the synergy across Microsoft, I would say, where you have studios that use Unreal Engine pretty well, like Ninja Theory, as well as the Coalition, where you can lean on some of the technology maybe they're developing too, and cross-pollinate across teams at Microsoft. Also, just in general, I think there were some weak points to Halo Infinite's graphics that we talked about before, and to advance that engine to the next level of being future-proofed and current-gen only, because it was a cross-gen game, bringing it to have current-gen features like something like ray trace global illumination, that would take a lot of engineering time in general. And making something like that with the time and resources you could put into it, why not just buy the technology to do that in the first place? You know, something like Lumen, which comes as a part of Unreal Engine 5. Basically, you're spending less time making base tech stuff and spending more time potentially making game stuff, art, game content, instead of engineering time. And you know, I think that's a compelling reason to change over, as long with getting rid of legacy stuff. That engine that you can talk about too. There was a lot of legacy issues in it, I think, that we saw come to bear when Halo Infinite came out, right?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously things like indirect lighting was very limited. There was a lot of issues with the way that distant scenery was displayed. They didn't handle shadows well in that regard. A lot of limitations just in terms of just the overall level of detail on display, and just everything else going on. It didn't come together in a way that I found especially compelling visually at a distance.
Right.
And was also very limited just in terms of modern image treatment. The image quality was not great. The TAA solution was rather poor, I would argue.
Oh, yeah.
Among so many, there's just so many other things. Plus, it launched with a lot of problems that were fixed, but things like consistency in terms of how frame rates were displayed in cutscenes. Anything that was not perfectly divisible by 60 or whatever, or 120 in that case, didn't display correctly, for instance. So there was definitely some strange issues there. So also, like you said, you know, working with Unreal sort of opens up the doors in terms of who they can hire. And knowing 343's previous sort of working methods with the high contractor turnover, employing a lot of people that would basically come in, work for a chunk of time, and then leave the project, it definitely behooves them, if they're going to continue down that road, to have access to people that can just jump in and start working with Unreal, rather than training them up on this new engine, using them for a year, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
Which, not great. And I think a lot of their problems probably centered from the way that the team was sort of structured and built, if I had to guess.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about, so I do want to kind of go through then the sort of like the advantages and the disadvantages of switching to Unreal, because on paper there's a lot of advantages, but there's also issues that we see crop up with this engine that have actually plagued nearly every release thus far this generation. So I mean, just let's get the ball rolling right away. Lumen is a big one, right? Because indirect lighting, just global illumination in general, something that Slipspace engine didn't do well.
Yeah.
It really failed. It really fell short here, right?
There's enough images where you sent me over Slack of like just random glowing blue stuff during the Halo Infinite launch. That was a big issue in the game visually. I don't know, obviously, if they're going for that same semi-open world design, but in general, getting good indirect lighting is actually a big part of Halo's history, because both Halo 1 and I would say Halo 3 went especially overboard for their time period of doing really good indirect lighting and like good area lights and things like that. Baked stuff, but still really well done for the time period. And then it kind of fell short as you get to titles like Halo Infinite, which had different requirements, moving times of day and larger worlds spanning cross generations. Beyond Lumen, though, there's another thing that I actually thought about when you were even just talking about Halo Infinite earlier, and that was world precision issues. If you recall,
yes,
your hands and a lot of objects in the game world in Halo Infinite, especially on console for some reason, would like jiggle. It looked like precision issues.
It seemed like the further you got away from 0-0, the center of the world, the precision, the math precision, caused major issues with how the polygons were rasterized.
Yeah.
Or the vertices, I guess. So you get this sort of warping swimming effect that reminded me of Kingpin, if I'm honest.
Best game ever made, right?
These types of problems are not necessarily, like, they have existed, and it's a known thing, but usually I feel like engines sort of like move the center with the player or within like a certain, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than just having, here's the center of the world, and the farther you away. Basically, the problem is as the numbers get bigger, the amount of decimal places available shrinks. So your precision is like going down mathematically. And that seemed to be what was happening in Halo Infinite.
Yeah.
So we're going to see that go away. And in addition, of course, things like nanite will be available, which is something very specifically useful for like super large open environments. And Halo obviously goes for the sweeping vistas. Essentially being able to eliminate LOD pop-in and get that nice smooth transition that nanite brings to the table will look really awesome. There's also some new stuff that was like recently revealed that I haven't actually had a chance to look at when I was in Japan.
Talk about that, sure.
The Mega Light stuff. I only caught a glimpse, and that seemed interesting.
Yeah, and in a case like Halo, right now, like the trailer that they showed didn't evidence that at all, actually.
Probably not. It's very new.
It was very new also. But Halo as a series, Mega Lights basically allows for shadow casting from every single light source within reason, I believe. It's using ray tracing to do that. And a game like Halo, actually, historically, especially like since like Halo Reach, there's been a lot of like point lights everywhere. Like, all the enemies with their plasma bolts flying around. There's all these lights in the environment. All the Covenant architecture has tons of little tiny lights all over it. Even Forerunner structures tend to. And, seeing something like that in Halo would be really amazing. Probably to amp up the atmosphere even more than this trailer already shows. One thing that I also thought about while looking at this trailer, they don't really show it off. They show off like, I think 2 elites and Master Chief, the Master Chief, John Spartan,
117.
Yeah,
Mr. 117 himself.
Does he have a last name? He probably does. The lore nerds out there are like, how does Alex not know John Spartan's real last name? One thing Halo Infinite had, and I think didn't do too well in comparison to maybe even its predecessors, was character rendering. You had like that Pelican guy, the guy driving the Pelican.
Character rendering in Halo it's kind of an up and down thing. And
it's an up and down thing, right?
343 managed to nail it with Halo 5. The character rendering in that game was stunning. You remember that?
Yeah. Oh, that's what I was. Yeah, yeah. I was like, that's great, but then you get to Halo Infinite, and it's like goes down
Yeah,
again.
it was a massive step down. Like it was like shockingly so. Like, wait, what happened here? Especially the pilot that you spend so much of the game with. He just looks so janky compared to everything in Halo 5, which yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah.
I guess here they could lever. I mean, Unreal's very good with rendering humans. There's stuff like, of course, meta humans in there that they could potentially leverage for some things if needed. But I suspect it'll be more custom
I agree
characters.
with that.
There's no real reason to do that in a game like this. But I'm curious to see what they can do there with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I was thinking about that. Also, I thought a bit about Unreal recently introduced Substrate, or I say recently, it's like 2 versions ago at this point, but it allows for some more
Right.
interesting types of materials than just, like metals and non-metals, like diffuse and specular.
The two types of metal.
The 2 types of things on this earth. And, I think the Halo series in the past especially had some really interesting looking materials in it. I always go back to like those Covenant structures. They had like weird, funky space plastics
Yes.
and stuff. I could imagine that they could do some
Yeah.
really great material work using something like Substrate to make Covenant stuff look really cool.
Agreed. So those are just some of the things that I think they could do really well, and you can kind of catch a glimpse of it in this initial footage. Although they very specifically stressed, which I thought was interesting, that they didn't want this to just be a tech demo. It sort of ties into that whole like Foundry thing that they were talked about, where they're essentially assembling like a large collection of assets and just things that is like Halo appropriate that they intend to use in the game, and they sort of made it very clear that that is the goal. And I suspect that's sort of them poking back maybe at the initial reveal for Halo Infinite with the Slipspace engine, which looked stunning and suggested that there was going to be a lot more going on in Halo Infinite than what there actually was in the end.
Yeah,
Huge
right?
disappointment that. So there's still the judgment's still out on that, but then there are some negative points to Unreal to consider, right?
Right.
Especially, first of all, in its current iteration, it's still extremely heavy on the CPU, and there's still issues with sort of stuttering and like data streaming, just moving through the world. And this is going to be a large game, probably, I guess. And it feels like a perfect storm for this sort of thing to manifest itself, with the only caveat being here, or not caveat, but more like the positive thing being here, is that I can imagine them, I could see them leveraging knowledge from a studio like the Coalition in building this to ensure that, like they kind of did at the end to get Halo Infinite somewhat fixed up, to really help them. Like, I think if they do it right, it could be okay, but this doesn't, you can't just eliminate things like massive CPU bottlenecks right away. And this is
Yeah.
something we've continued, I think, to be skeptical and I would say disappointed with in terms of basically every Unreal Engine 5 console game to date, where it's just absolutely, they just don't run that well.
Yeah, they other than the 30 FPS modes, which are they're fine enough usually. It's Unreal's been super heavy for the consoles this gen, and they're only announcing this now, and we are already 4 years into this current generation, right? So maybe this is a next gen title. That's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But, and there's also going to be a lot of iteration between Unreal, between now and whenever this next title comes out. So maybe there's a lot of work to be done still to make that better. But that's one thing that made me a little bit worried, especially considering Halo games tend to be a lot more open than other, first person shooters like Call of Duty or whatever. So another thing that I thought about with this is Xbox Series S scaling. Unreal has yet to scale super gracefully in every single game out there,
To say the least.
on this Xbox Series S. And I don't know, it'd be kind of weird for Microsoft to make a next gen only Halo at this point. Maybe this is what that is. I have no idea. But I was just trying to imagine the footage they were showing scaling to Xbox Series S, and I was like, no way. I just was like, no way.